Along the coastal plantations of McIntosh County, Georgia, a strange notation appears again and again in 17, surviving ledgers from the 1830s. Each record lists the measurements of a woman whose physical proportions defied every expectation of her era. A 48-inch chest, arms nearly 19 inches around, shoulders stretching 23 inches across. To the plantation owners, she was not a woman at all, but their greatest investment had made these measurements remarkable wasn't sheer size, it was what they revealed. They were the result of a deliberate 3-generation breeding experiment engineered to create a woman whose strength became both her prison and her only means of resistance. Then now, the coastal humidity seems to cling to the archived papers that document her existence, the fading ink carrying the scent of something far darker, the calculated cruelty of men who treated human beings as livestock to be perfected. The records fall abruptly silent in 1847, but everything written before that cessation forces us to confront harrowing questions about survival, vengeance, and the desperate measures people take to reclaim their humanity. Maritime historians who study the Georgia coast speak in quiet, uneasy tones about the harrow of documentation. Several researchers have abandoned the project altogether after reading the unedited journals. The measurements, as disturbing as they are, tell only the surface story. The real horror lies in the method, the generational planning, the meticulous calculations, the cold precision with which lives were reduced to data points, bar, ND. This is only the beginning. Before we continue with the story of the woman known in the records only as number 47, if untold histories like this captivate you, if you want more stories that expose the darkest chapters of America's past, make sure to subscribe and tell us in the comments which state you're listening from. Some histories fade by design. Stories like this must not be forgotten. The archived documents from McIntosh County don't just contain numbers, they contain the blueprint of an obsession that consumed 3 generations of the Harrow family and left a mark on Georgia history that officials tried desperately to erase. The Harrow Plantation sat between the Altamaha River and the Atlantic coast, where the air hung thick with salt and the constant buzz of insects created a background hum that never ceased. By 1810, Alexander Hargrove had built his fortune on rice cultivation, transforming tidal marshlands into productive fields through a brutal system that required constant labor in knee-deep water under the merciless Georgia sun. But Alexander harbored ambitions that went beyond mere wealth. He'd spent 18 months in Jamaica during 1807 and 1808, ostensibly studying sugar operations. But his real education came from observing what plantation owners there called selective improvement, the practice of breeding enslaved people for specific physical traits, treating human reproduction as a form of agricultural science. Alexander returned to Georgia with 3 leather-bound journals filled with observations, measurements, and theoretical frameworks for human breeding. He documented successful pairings in Jamaica, noted which physical characteristics seemed hereditary, and developed his own theories about how to enhance strength, endurance, and physical size across generations. His wife, Charlotte, found the journals disturbing and refused to discuss them, which suited Alexander perfectly. This was work he intended to pursue without interference, without moral questioning, without the sentimentality that he believed weakened other plantation owners. The plantation itself sprawled across 2,000 acres, with the main house positioned on a slight elevation that allowed the Hargroves to survey their fields and the quarters where 300 enslaved people lived in conditions of calculated misery. The main house was built in the Georgian style with white columns and wide verandas designed to catch coastal breezes. Inside, the furnishings reflected Alexander's wealth. Imported furniture from England, silver from Charleston, crystal from France. The contrast between the elegance of the main house and the crude wooden structures of the quarters was deliberate, a physical manifestation of the hierarchy Alexander believed was natural and necessary. Alexander's approach to plantation management was methodical. He kept detailed records of every enslaved person, their skills, their health, their family relationships, their capacity for work. but he also kept a separate set of records locked in his study that documented what he called his improvement program. These records noted physical measurements, tracked family lineages, and identified individuals who possessed traits he considered valuable. He was particularly interested in height, muscular development, bone structure, and what he termed constitutional vigor, the ability to withstand harsh conditions without succumbing to illness. By 1815, Alexander had identified several families within his enslaved population that he considered promising for his breeding experiments. He began controlling who could form partnerships, separating couples who didn't meet his criteria, and forcing unions between people he believed would produce children with desired traits. The cruelty of this system was compounded by its calculated nature. Alexander didn't act from passion or impulse, but from cold scientific reasoning that made every forced separation and arranged union part of a larger plan. The quarters operated under their own social structures that Alexander never fully understood. People maintained African traditions brought across the Atlantic, practiced spiritual beliefs that blended Christianity with older religions, and created tight-knit communities that provided emotional support in a world designed to crush their spirits. They sang work songs that carried coded messages, told stories that preserved history and culture, and developed sophisticated systems for sharing resources and protecting the vulnerable. Among the enslaved population were natural leaders who commanded respect through wisdom, courage, or spiritual authority. One such person was a woman named Zena, elderly by the standards of the time at 53, who served as a midwife and healer. Zena had been born in West Africa and survived the Middle Passage as a child. She remembered freedom, and she kept that memory alive by teaching younger generations about their heritage, about dignity, about the fact that their current condition was not natural or inevitable, but imposed by force. Zena watched Alexander's breeding program with growing alarm. She'd delivered babies for 2 decades, and she'd seen families torn apart when children didn't develop according to Alexander's expectations. She understood what he was trying to do: create a line of enslaved people who would be more valuable, more productive, and therefore more thoroughly trapped in bondage. Her opposition to this program was both practical and spiritual. She believed that controlling human reproduction in this way violated natural law and invited consequences that Alexander couldn't foresee. But Zena had no power to stop Alexander Harov. She could only document what she witnessed. Passing information to people she trusted, creating an oral history that would preserve the truth even if official records were destroyed. She taught younger people to remember names, dates, and details, transforming memory into a form of resistance against a system that wanted to erase individual humanity. Alexander's son, Marcus Harov, was born in 1802 and raised in an environment where his father's breeding program was simply part of plantation management. Marcus never questioned the morality of treating people as livestock. It was the only system he knew, and his father presented it as enlightened agricultural science rather than systematic dehumanization. By the time Marcus was 15, he was accompanying his father on inspections of the quarters, learning to evaluate people with the same clinical detachment Alexander used, seeing human beings as investments to be optimized. Marcus inherited both the plantation and the obsession in 1825, when Alexander died from a fever that swept through the coastal region. Marcus was 23, newly married to a Savannah merchant's daughter named Elizabeth, and determined to prove himself worthy of his inheritance. He'd spent his adolescence studying his father's journals, and he believed he could improve upon Alexander's methods by applying even more systematic observation and record-keeping. Marcus expanded the breeding program significantly. Where Alexander had focused on a few families, Marcus cast a wider net, evaluating the entire enslaved population and identifying multiple family lines for selective breeding. He hired an overseer specifically to help with this work, a German immigrant named Klaus Reinhardt, who'd worked on a horse breeding farm in Pennsylvania and brought those same principles to human breeding without apparent moral qualms. Reinhardt kept a leather-bound journal where he recorded measurements, work capacity, ND physical development with meticulous attention to detail. His handwriting was beautiful, almost artistic, a stark contrast to the horror of what he was documenting. He measured children starting at age 3, tracking their growth patterns, noting which ones showed early signs of strength or size. He evaluated adults for breeding potential, matching people based on physical characteristics rather than their own choices or feelings. His journal entries read like livestock records. Male 23, height 62, chest 44, suitable for pairing with female 17 or female 19, produced male child measuring 22 at birth. Above average, continue monitoring. Life in the quarters operated under constant surveillance. People lived in wooden structures that measured approximately 12 by 14 feet and housed entire families. The buildings leaked during the frequent coastal rains and baked during summer months when temperatures regularly exceeded 95 degrees with humidity that made breathing feel like work. They slept on rough wooden pallets covered with corn shuck mattresses, wore clothing made from coarse Ozenberg fabric that chafed their skin, and received rations calculated to provide just enough calories to maintain work capacity without improving overall health. The work itself was brutal. Rice cultivation required constant labor in standing water, which created ideal conditions for mosquitoes that spread malaria and yellow fever. Workers spent hours bent over in flooded fields, their hands cut by sharp rice stalks, their bodies exposed to sun that caused heat exhaustion and heat stroke. During harvest season, the work lasted from first light until darkness made it impossible to continue, and even then there were processing tasks that extended into the night. But for some families, there was an additional burden. They were part of the Harrow's breeding program. Their reproductive lives controlled as ethically as their labor. Women were monitored for pregnancy, examined by Reinhardt to ensure healthy development, and separated from partners if pregnancies didn't occur within expected time frames. Children born into the program were evaluated constantly, their bodies measured and documented, their every developmental milestone recorded in Reinhardt's journals. The coastal region had developed its own distinct culture among the enslaved population. Many had Gullah Geechee heritage, maintaining linguistic patterns that blended African languages with English, creating a dialect that their overseers struggled to understand. They cooked traditional foods, okra, rice dishes, fish from coastal waters, maintaining culinary traditions that connected them to African roots. They created art through basket weaving using sweet G grass and palmetto fronds to make intricate patterns that carried symbolic meanings. They maintained spiritual practices that incorporated African beliefs using music, dance, and ritual to preserve cultural identity. Among this population was a family that would become central to Marcus Harrow's greatest experiment. The woman known in plantation records as Denina stood nearly 6 trillions tall, unusual for any woman of the era, but particularly notable in a population where poor nutrition typically stunted growth. She'd been born on the plantation in 1800, making her 25 when Marcus inherited the property. Denina worked in the rice fields, and overseers noted her capacity for heavy labor, her resistance to common illnesses, and her unusual physical strength. Her partner, listed only as Big Tom in plantation records, measured 6 feet 4 inches in and possessed extraordinary strength that made him valuable for tasks requiring brute force. Tom had been purchased from a Virginia plantation in 1823, separated from his family as part of a debt settlement. He'd arrived at the Harrow Plantation, angry and grieving, but he'd found in Dina someone who understood loss, and together they'd built a relationship that provided emotional anchor in a world designed to prevent exactly that kind of human connection. Marcus Harrow saw Dina and Tom and envisioned the future of his breeding program. He believed that pairing 2 people with such pronounced physical characteristics would produce children who inherited the best traits of both parents. He approved their union, one of the few times enslaved people's own choices aligned with plantation management's breeding decisions, and he waited with keen anticipation for results that would validate his theories. On a March morning in 1826, as dawn light filtered through the cracks in the quarters, birthing room, Dinah went into labor. The birthing room was a cramped space, barely 10 feet square, with a dirt floor covered by straw and walls that had been whitewashed years earlier, but now showed stains from countless previous births. The air inside was stale and heavy, thick with the smell of sweat and the metallic scent of blood. Zena attended the birth along with 2 younger women who were learning midwifery skills, and they moved around Dinah with practiced efficiency, bringing water from the well, preparing cloths, murmuring encouragement in Gula-inflected English that carried the rhythms of African languages. Labor lasted through the morning and into early afternoon. Dinah bore the pain with remarkable stoicism, gritting her teeth and breathing through contractions while Zena monitored progress and offered what comfort she could. The other women in the quarters knew what was happening. Word had spread that Dinah was delivering, and many found excuses to pass near the birthing room, offering silent support through proximity, even though they weren't allowed inside during the actual delivery. The baby arrived just after 2. In the afternoon, emerging into Zena's experienced hands with a cry that was notably vigorous. Zena cut the umbilical cord with a blade she'd sterilized over fire, tied it off with practiced motions, and handed the infant to one of her assistants for cleaning while she attended to Dinah, ensuring the afterbirth delivered completely and checking for complications that frequently made childbirth deadly for enslaved women who received no professional medical care. The baby was a girl, healthy and unusually large. Even before proper measurement, Zena could see this was no ordinary infant. The baby's limbs were proportionally longer than average, her body more robust, her cries stronger and more sustained. Zena felt a chill of premonition as she cleaned and examined the child. She'd seen Marcus Harrow's interest in Dinah and Tom's union, understood what he was hoping for, and she feared what this baby's exceptional characteristics might mean for her future. Within 2 hours, Klaus Reinhardt appeared at the birthing room. His arrival was unprecedented. Overseers didn't typically involve themselves in births unless complications arose that threatened plantation property. But Reinhardt had been instructed by Marcus Harrow to attend this particular birth personally, to document everything to provide immediate assessment of the child's characteristics. Reinhardt entered the small space with his journal and measuring tools, creating an atmosphere of clinical observation that violated the intimacy of the moment. He examined the infant with the careful attention of someone inspecting valuable property, measuring her length with a cloth tape, noting the circumference of her head, chest, arms, and legs. He recorded her weight using a scale normally employed for measuring tobacco leaves. The baby, only hours old, became a subject of scientific study rather than a celebration of new life. Edina watched this examination with exhausted weariness. She'd known this moment would come, had understood throughout her pregnancy that her child would be special interest to the Harrows, but witnessing the reality of Reinhardt's clinical assessment made the situation undeniably clear. Her daughter was not truly hers, but property of the plantation, an investment to be monitored and developed according to Marcus Hargrove's vision. Reinhardt made his notations with satisfaction evident in his expression. The baby measured 23 in long, significantly above the average of 18 to 20 in for newborns. Her weight was 8 lb 3 ounces, healthy but not exceptional, but her length and the proportional development of her limbs suggested potential for significant height and muscular development. Reinhardt wrote these observations in his journal, then added a note that this infant represented promising initial results for the breeding program. Marcus Harrow appeared before sunset, leaving the main house to visit the quarters personally, another unprecedented action that signaled the importance he placed on this birth. He stood in the birthing room's doorway, too Phidias to enter the space, but close enough to observe, while Reinhardt reported his findings. Marcus listened with the intense focus he brought to all matters related to his breeding program, asking detailed questions about measurements, comparing them to data from his father's journals, projecting potential adult development based on birth characteristics. Then Marcus issued instructions that would define the child's entire existence. She was to receive extra rations beginning immediately. Her mother would be given additional food during nursing to ensure optimal milk production. The child's physical development was to be monitored weekly for the first year, then monthly thereafter. She would be trained specifically for Ta'a. SKs that would build muscle mass once she was old enough for work assignments. Most significantly, Marcus assigned the baby a designation, number 47 in the plantation's breeding records. The number referred to her position in a numbered list of children born into the breeding program, a cold bureaucratic designation that reduced a human being to data in a ledger. Dinina wanted to name her daughter Sarah after her own grandmother, who'd been born in Africa and maintained fierce dignity until her death. It was a small act of humanity, an assertion that this child was a person with identity and heritage, not merely experimental property. But the name Sarah never appeared in official plantation records. To Marcus Harrove, Klaus Reinhardt, and the administrative apparatus of the plantation, the baby was simply 47, a number representing investment, expectation, and the validation of theories about human breeding. The extra food rations created immediate complications in the quarters. Food was already scarce, distributed in carefully measured amounts designed to maintain work capacity without promoting health or strength. Now Dina and her infant received portions of salt pork, cornmeal, and beans that exceeded standard rations taken from the same limited supply meant to feed 300 people. Some resented this special treatment, seeing it as favoritism that came at their expense. Others understood it was a poisoned gift. The extra food came with strings attached with expectations and control that would make the child's life a different form of hell than the starvation that characterized most enslaved people's existence. Zena tried to help Dinina navigate this situation. She advised discretion, suggested sharing some of the extra food with others to build community support rather than resentment. She warned that the child would face unique challenges as she grew, would need the calm, community's protection and solidarity, and alienating people through perceived privilege, even involuntary privilege imposed by owners, would make survival harder. Dinina listened to this advice and tried to follow it. She shared what she could, maintained relationships with other women in the quarters, and tried to raise her daughter with some semblance of normal childhood, despite the constant surveillance and measurement that characterized every stage of the girl's development. As baby 47, whom Diner called Sarah in private moments, grew through her first year, the differences became increasingly apparent. By 3 months, she was noticeably larger than other infants her age. By 6 months, she was pulling herself up and showing unusually strong grip strength. By her first birthday, she was walking steadily and displaying coordination that typically developed later. Reinhardt documented everything. His journal entries during this period read like livestock breeding records. Subject 47 at 6 months shows 15% greater muscle mass in arms compared to average superior grip strength noted during examination. Mother continues healthy, milk production adequate. Recommend maintaining enhanced rations through weaning period, or subject 47 at 10 months demonstrates advanced motor development. Walking without assistance as of October 3, 1826. Father's height genetics apparently express projecting adult height 6 to 63. Muscle attachment points suggest capacity for significant strength development. Marcus Hargrove read these reports with deep satisfaction. His breeding program was producing exactly the results he'd hoped for, validating years of theory and planning. He began thinking about the next generation, about which male children in the program would be appropriate matches for Subject 47 when she reached breeding age. He made notes in his own journals projecting timelines, anticipating outcomes, treating the far future of a 1-year-old baby as already determined and mapped. The quarters watched Sarah's development with mixed feelings. Some saw her as evidence that resistance was futile. The Harrows could literally breed people for their purposes, controlling not just labor but biology itself. Others saw her as a potential source of pride, proof that enslaved people could be strong and exceptional even in bondage. A few, including Zena, feared what would happen when Sarah became fully aware of what she was being made into, what she represented, and what her future held. By age 2, Sarah was speaking in full sentences, demonstrating intelligence that matched her physical precocity. She absorbed the language of the quarters, learning both standard English and the Gulagichi dialect that was still widely spoken. She learned songs that carried coded messages, heard stories about ancestors in Africa, and absorbed the culture of resistance that permeated enslaved communities even under constant surveillance. But she also became aware of being different. Other children her age were smaller, less strong, less constantly observed. Sarah noticed Reinhardt measuring her, noting how other adults watched her with a mixture of pride and concern. She began to understand in the intuitive way children grasp complex situations without fully comprehending them, that she was special, but that this specialness was not entirely positive. The years between 1828 and 1835 marked Sarah's transformation from a precocious toddler into a child whose physical development exceeded every projection Marcus Harrove had made. By age 5, she stood nearly 4 trillions tall, towering over children her own age and matching the height of children 3 or 4 years older. Her body showed unusual muscle definition that typically didn't appear until adolescence. Her arms and legs were proportionally longer than average, giving her a gangly appearance that suggested she would eventually achieve remarkable height. Reinhardt's measurements during this period documented systematic growth that seemed to validate every theory about hereditary traits and selective breeding. At age 5, Sarah's chest measured 30 in around. Her arms measured 9 in circumference, and her shoulders spanned 14 in. These numbers appeared constantly in Reinhardt's journals, accompanied by observations about her physical capabilities, her coordination, her apparent health and vigor, but the measurements didn't capture the psychological reality of Sarah's existence. She was aware now, fully conscious of being constantly evaluated, measured, observed. Every week, Reinhardt would summon her to a small building near the main house that served as his office. She would stand on a raised platform while he measured various parts of her body, recorded data in his journal, sometimes made her lift objects or perform physical tasks while he noted her capabilities. These sessions were humiliating and frightening. Sarah learned to dissociate during them to let her mind drift while her body remained present for Reinhardt's clinical assessment. Marcus Harrove increased her food rations again as she grew, ensuring she received portions that included meat, beans, vegetables, and cornbread, a diet substantially better than what most enslaved people received. This created ongoing tension in the quarters. Food remained scarce for everyone else, and seeing a child receive preferential treatment while adults went hungry generated resentment that Sarah could feel even when people tried to hide it. Her mother, Danina, tried to shield her from some of this resentment by continuing to share what they received, but there was only so much she could do. The reality was that Sarah's existence had become political in the quarter's social structure. She represented the breeding program's success, and people's attitudes toward her reflected their attitudes toward the system itself. Whether they'd been broken into accepting it, whether they maintained hope for resistance, whether they'd found ways to survive psychologically by not thinking too deeply about their situation. At age 7, Sarah was put to work. Most enslaved children began light labor around this age, tasks appropriate to their size and strength. But Sarah's assignments were different, specifically designed to build her physical capabilities. She carried loads of rice shave from fields to processing areas, developing her back and leg muscles. She dragged heavy baskets, building upper body strength. She spent hours at tasks that would have been given to adolescent boys, and she performed them adequately despite her young age. Marcus Hargrove watched this progress with satisfaction that bordered on obsession. He'd begun inviting other plantation owners to visit, showing them his records, explaining his breeding program, displaying Sarah as evidence that selective breeding could produce superior workers. These visits were torture for Sarah. She was made to stand still while men discussed her body as if she were livestock. evaluated her measurements against their own enslaved populations, debated the financial implications of implementing similar programs. Some visitors were impressed, seeing potential profits in Marcus's approach. Others were skeptical, questioning whether the investment required for such programs would yield sufficient returns. A few expressed moral discomfort, though they typically did so quietly and without seriously challenging the fundamental premise that enslaved people could be bred like animals. Sarah absorbed all of this. She listened to conversations not meant for her ears, learned to read men. Expressions and tones developed an understanding of how she was perceived and what her existence meant within the larger system of slavery. This knowledge was both empowering and devastating. Empowering because it gave her insight into her captor's thinking. Devastating because it confirmed that she was not seen as fully human by the people who controlled every aspect of her life. During this period, Zena continued serving as a source of wisdom and alternative perspective. She was elderly now, moving more slowly, but still respected throughout the quarters for her knowledge and moral authority. Zena spent time with Sarah when she could, teaching her about African heritage, about ancestors who'd been free, about the fact that enslavement was not natural or inevitable, but a condition imposed by force and maintained through violence. These conversations gave Sarah a framework for understanding her situation that differed radically from Marcus Harrow's narrative. Where Marcus saw successful breeding and improved property, Zena taught Sarah to see systematic dehumanization and the violation of natural law. Where Marcus celebrated Sarah's strength as evidence of his theories, Zena helped Sarah understand that her strength was her own, an inherent part of who she was rather than something created by the Groves program. But Zena also taught Sarah to be patient, to survive, to wait for opportunities rather than acting from anger in ways that would get her killed. The coastal regions had seen multiple slave rebellions over the years. The Stono Rebellion in South Carolina in 1739, Denmark Vif's planned uprising in Charleston in 1822, Nat Turner's rebellion in Virginia in 1831, all had been violently suppressed with participants executed and communities subjected to increased surveillance and brutality. Zena knew that resistance was necessary, but had to be strategic, timed, Our moments when success was possible rather than dramatic gestures that resulted in death without achieving freedom. By age 10, Sarah had internalized this lesson. Survive first, resist strategically, wait for the right moment. She continued performing her assigned labor, submitted to Reinhardt's measurements without visible resistance, and maintained a facade of compliance that masked growing awareness and carefully controlled rage. Her physical development continued to exceed projections. At 10, she stood 5 feet 6 inches in tall, with measurements that approached those of adult women. Her arms measured 14 in around, her chest 38 in, her shoulders 20 in across. She could lift loads that adult men struggled with, and Marcus Harrow documented every achievement with pride that completely ignored Sarah's humanity. He'd begun showing her off more frequently now, hosting gatherings where plantation owners from across Georgia and neighboring states came specifically to observe Sarah and hear about the breeding program. These gatherings followed a predictable pattern. Marcus would lecture about his methods and theories, Reinhardt would present documented measurements and development timelines, and then Sarah would be brought out to demonstrate her strength. She would be made to lift heavy objects, 60 lb sacks of rice, barrels filled with water, even an anvil that weighed close to 200 lb. She would be made to stand still while men walked around her, examining her musculature, discussing her body as if she weren't present. Sometimes they would ask her questions. How old was she? Did she experience fatigue? Could she work full days without rest? And she learned to answer in ways that satisfied them without revealing her true thoughts. The humiliation of these exhibitions was profound and cumulative. Each one reinforced Sarah's understanding that she was not a person to these men, but an X. Ample, a proof of concept, a thing to be evaluated and potentially replicated. The shame burned inside her, creating pressure that built with each passing year, but had no outlet, nowhere to be released without catastrophic consequences. During private moments with her mother, Sarah sometimes let this pressure show. She would cry from frustration and rage, would question why this was happening to her, would express desperate wishes for escape or revenge. Denina held her during these moments, provided what comfort she could, but she also reinforced Zena's lessons about patience and survival. Denina knew that Sarah's strength made her valuable, and valuable property was watched too closely to escape easily. Any attempt at running would fail, and the punishment would be severe. So Sarah learned to mask her emotions, to present a blank face to the world while fury built inside her like steam in a sealed container. She learned to dissociate during the exhibitions, letting her mind drift to other places while her body remained present for the spectator's evaluation. She learned to survive psychologically in a situation designed to break her spirit without damaging the physical strength that Marcus Harrow prized. By age 12, Sarah's measurements exceeded those of most adult women and many men. She stood 5 feet 11 inches in tall with a chest measuring 42 in, arms measuring 17 in around, and shoulders spanning 22 in. Her physical strength was extraordinary. She could lift over 300 lb, could work continuously for hours without apparent fatigue, and showed no signs of the health problems that plagued many enslaved people who suffered from poor nutrition and constant disease exposure. Marcus Hargrove commissioned a traveling artist to paint Sarah's portrait. The artist, a man named Benjamin Crawford from Charleston, spent 3 days on the plantation in September 1838, sketching Sarah from multiple angles before creating a formal oil painting. Crawford positioned Sarah in profile, emphasizing her muscular development with lighting that highlighted the definition of her arms and shoulders. The painting was technically accomplished, but deeply dehumanizing. It portrayed Sarah as a specimen rather than a person, focusing entirely on physical attributes while erasing any hint of her inner life or emotional reality. The finished portrait hung in Marcus Harrow's study, where he brought visitors specifically to view it. He would stand before the painting and lecture about his breeding program, using Sarah's image as evidence that human beings could be systematically improved through careful selection of breeding pairs. The painting became famous in certain circles, discussed at gatherings of plantation owners, referenced in private correspondence about agricultural innovations. Sarah saw the painting once when Reinhardt brought her to Marcus's study for some measurement-related discussion. The sight of her own image, reduced to decoration in Marcus Harrow's private space displayed for his pride and other men's education, created a moment of such intense humiliation and rage that Sarah had to leave the room quickly, fearing she would lose control and attack someone. That image, herself as object, as property, as proof of Marcus Harrow's theories, became fixed in her mind as a symbol of everything she was being made into against her will. The years between 1838 and 1843 marked Sarah's final transformation from adolescent into adult, and the changes in her body exceeded even Marcus Harrow's most optimistic projections. By age 15, she'd reached her full height of 6 feet 1 inch in, making her taller than virtually every man on the plantation, and certainly taller than any woman. Her physical development created a presence that was impossible to ignore. When Sarah entered a space, he dominated it simply through size and strength. Her measurements during this period documented systematic, muscular development that Reinhardt described in his journals as unprecedented in female subjects and remarkable even compared to male workers selected for strength. At 18, Sarah's chest measured 48 in around, her arms 19 in circumference, her shoulders spanning 23 in, and her thighs measuring 28 in around. These numbers appeared in countless journal entries, always accompanied by Reinhardt's observations about work capacity, physical capabilities, and breeding potential. But numbers couldn't capture what it meant to inhabit Sarah's body, to possess strength that should have been empowering, but instead made her more thoroughly trapped. She understood by now that her physical capabilities were the very reason she would never be free. She was too valuable to Marcus Hargrove. Financially, yes, but more importantly, as validation of his life's work. Proof that his theories were correct. Evidence that his breeding program succeeded. Marcus's obsession with Sarah had intensified as she'd grown. He spoke about her constantly to visitors, wrote about her in letters to other plantation owners, and maintained detailed projections about her future breeding potential. He'd already identified several male children in the program who would be appropriate matches when they reached maturity, planning Sarah's reproductive life years in advance with the same cold calculation he'd used selecting stud horses. Sarah was aware of these plans. Information moved through the quarters in complex ways. Household staff overheard conversations in the main house and shared them. Field workers noticed which children received extra attention from Reinhardt. People pieced together the larger picture from fragments of information. Sarah knew that Marcus intended to breed her, to use her body T. O produced the next generation of his experiment, and the knowledge sat inside her like poison, corroding any sense of hope or future that she might have tried to maintain. During this period, Sarah was assigned to the rice mills, massive structures where harvested rice was processed through a series of steps that required constant heavy lifting. Workers carried 60 lb sacks of rice from storage areas to processing stations, lifted the sacks onto tables for sorting, then carried processed rice to wagons for transport. The work was brutal for anyone. For Sarah, it became a daily demonstration of the strength Marcus Harrov had spent her entire life developing. She worked alongside men, many of whom were chosen for field work, specifically because of their size and strength. Sarah outperformed most of them. She could carry heavier loads, work longer hours without rest, maintain pace that left others exhausted. The men she worked with had complex reactions to this. Some respected her abilities, others felt threatened or emasculated. Most understood that her strength was both impressive and tragic. Evidence of what the system could do to people when it treated them as breeding stock rather than human beings. The mills were places of constant danger. The machinery, giant mortars and pestles powered by treadmills and water wheels, could crush hands or arms if workers weren't careful. The dust from rice husks filled the air, making breathing difficult and causing lung problems for people who worked there for years. The heat was oppressive, with temperatures inside the mills often exceeding 100 degrees during summer months. Sarah worked in these conditions from age 15 through age 18, and Marcus Hargrove used her performance as further evidence of his program's success. He brought visitors to observe her working, pointing out how she handled loads that required 2 men to lift, how she maintained pace throughout long days, how she showed no signs of the health deterioration that affected other mill workers. These demonstrations were exhibitions disguised as normal work, and Sarah understood that every moment of her labor was being evaluated, documented, turned into evidence for Marcus's theories about human breeding. The visitors who came during this period included some of the South's wealthiest and most influential plantation owners. They came from South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, and deeper South states like Alabama and Mississippi. They toured the plantation with Marcus, examined his records, and always ended with observations of Sarah working in the mills. Their reactions ranged from impressed to skeptical to disturbed, but most saw potential financial applications if the breeding program's principles could be replicated on their own plantations. One visitor during the summer of 1842 was particularly significant, a Louisiana plantation owner named Charles Dupree, who operated a massive sugar operation near New Orleans. Dupree had heard about Marcus Harrov's breeding program through correspondence with other plantation owners, and he'd traveled to Georgia specifically to see Sarah and evaluate whether the program's claims were legitimate. He spent 4 days on the plantation, examined Reinhardt's journals in detail, interviewed Marcus extensively about his methods, and observed Sarah working in the mills for extended periods. Dupree was impressed. He saw Sarah as proof that human beings could indeed be selectively bred for desired characteristics, and he believed that applying similar methods on his Louisiana plantation would yield significant economic benefits. Sugar cultivation was even more brutal than rice farming, requiring enormous physical strength for cutting cane, hauling loads, and operating processing machinery. Workers who were Stronger, more resilient, and capable of sustained heavy labor would be enormously valuable. On the evening of Dupree's final day, he made Marcus Harrove an offer. He would purchase Sarah for $5,000, an extraordinary sum that reflected both her demonstrated capabilities and her potential for breeding the next generation. Dry explained his vision. He would pair Sarah with the strongest male workers on his Louisiana plantation, monitor the resulting children, and potentially develop his own line of specially bred workers that would make his sugar operation the most productive in the region. Marcus's initial reaction was refusal. Sarah represented 17 years of careful work, the culmination of his father's theories and his own refinements. Selling her would mean abandoning the program or starting over with younger subjects who would take decades to develop, but $5,000 was an enormous sum, more money than Marcus had ever been offered for any enslaved person. The offer forced him to consider questions he'd avoided. Was Sarah more valuable as a symbol of his success, or as liquid capital that could be invested in expanding his operations? He asked Dry for time to consider, and Dry agreed, returning to Louisiana with the understanding that Marcus would send word within a month about whether he accepted the offer. Sarah learned of the potential sale through the household staff, enslaved people who worked in the main house, and overheard the negotiations between Marcus and Dry. The news spread through the quarters in whispers, passed from person to person until everyone knew that Sarah might be sold away from Georgia, separated from her family and community, sent to Louisiana to become the foundation of another man's breeding program. The reaction in the quarters was mixed. Some saw the sale as an opportunity for Sarah. Louisiana was further from Marcus Harrow's control, and perhaps he would find ways to escape or resist that weren't possible in Georgia. Others understood that the sale would simply transfer her to a different form of bondage with no guarantee of better conditions and the certainty of losing the only community she'd ever known. For Sarah, the news was devastating. She'd endured 17 years of systematic dehumanization by holding on to connection with her mother, with Zena, with the community that had raised her. The thought of being torn away from these bonds, isolated in Louisiana with no one who knew her history or cared about her beyond her breeding potential, created a desperation she'd never felt before. She spent a night in the quarters talking with her mother and Zena, trying to understand what options existed. Danina was in tears, holding Sarah and expressing helpless fury at a system that could tear families apart on economic whim. Zena was more pragmatic, though no less sorrowful. She explained that if the sale went through, Sarah would have to find new allies in Louisiana, would have to rebuild community connections, would have to survive and wait for opportunities to resist. But Zena also said something that planted a seed in Sarah's mind. You're stronger than any of them. Of stronger than the overseers, stronger than Marcus Harrove, maybe stronger than several men combined. They've given you this strength, thinking it makes you more valuable to them. But strength can be used for other purposes. Remember that. Those words, strength can be used for other purposes, echoed in Sarah's thoughts for days. She'd spent her entire life being told that her strength existed to serve the Harrow's interest, to make their plantation more profitable, to validate their theories about human breeding. But what if her strength could serve different purposes? What if the very capabilities they'd built into her could be turned against the stem that had created them? She began thinking differently about her situation. She began observing the plantation's operations with new attention, noticing vulnerabilities, understanding how dependent the entire system was on enslaved people's cooperation. She began having quiet conversations with people she trusted, testing ideas, gauging whether others would support action if opportunities arose. The late summer of 1842 brought news that complicated everything. Marcus Hargrove had agreed to sell Sarah to Charles Dry. The sale would be finalized after the rice harvest concluded in October, giving Marcus time to ensure maximum profit from the growing season before losing Sarah's labor. The price was $5,000, and the terms specified that Sarah would be transported to Louisiana immediately after payment with no delay that might allow her to escape or create problems. Sarah had approximately 2 months to decide what she would do. The period between learning of the sale and its scheduled completion became a crucible for Sarah, a time when every decision carried weight that would determine not just her future, but potentially the futures of others in the quarters. She couldn't sleep more than a few hours each night, her mind constantly working through possibilities, evaluating options, trying to find some path forward that didn't end in death or worse conditions than she already endured. The first decision she made was to start training others. She'd spent 17 years building strength through work, and through the extra rations Marcus Hargrove provided, she understood how to develop physical capabilities, and she began sharing this knowledge in the early morning hours before work assignments began. She would gather small groups, never more than 4 or 5 people at a time, to avoid suspicion, and teach them exercises that built strength, techniques for lifting heavy loads, efficiently, ways to increase endurance. She presented this training as practical, as methods for making the brutal work slightly more bearable by being physically stronger. But her real purpose was to create a group of people who would be capable of physical resistance if opportunities arose. She was preparing for possibilities she couldn't fully articulate yet, building capacity for action while understanding that the moment to act might never come. The people she trained responded with varying levels of enthusiasm. Some understood immediately what Sarah was really doing and committed themselves fully to the training. Others participated but remained skeptical that anything could actually be done against a system backed by overwhelming force and legal authority. A few refused entirely, too frightened of consequences or too broken by years of bondage to imagine that resistance was possible. Among those who committed fully was a man named Isaac, 32 years old, who'd been born on the plantation and worked as a field hand. Isaac had watched Sarah's development over the years with a mixture of awe and sorrow, understanding that she was both extraordinary and trapped. He'd lost his own wife and children when Marcus Hargrove sold them to Alabama Plantation in 1839 to settle a debt, and the loss had left him with nothing to lose, making him willing to take risks that others avoided. Isaac became Sarah's closest ally during this period. He helped recruit others for the training sessions, provided strategic thinking about how resistance might work if it came to that, and offered emotional support to Sarah as she navigated the psychological burden of planning something that could get everyone killed. Another key figure was a woman named Esther, 28 years old, who worked in the main house as a cook. Esther's position gave her access to information that field workers never heard. She overheard conversations between Marcus and Elizabeth Hargrove, listened to discussions with visitors, and noticed documents left visible in Marcus's study. She passed this information to Sarah whenever possible, creating an intelligence network that helped Sarah understand exactly what was being planned and what vulnerabilities might exist. Through Esther, Sarah learned details about the sale that weren't common knowledge. Charles Dry had paid half the purchase price up front, with the remaining $2,500 to be paid upon Sarah's delivery to Louisiana. Marcus had hired professional slave catchers to transport Sarah, men known for brutal efficiency in preventing escape attempts during transfers. The transport was scheduled for October 28, 1843, immediately following the final rice harvest. Sarah also learned something that changed her entire understanding of Marcus Harrove's breeding program through Esther's observations. Sarah discovered that Marcus kept additional records in his study, documents that went beyond the measurements and evaluations in Reinhardt's journals. These records detailed the full scope of the breeding program over 3 generations, included information about enslaved people who'd been sold or who died as part of the experiments, and contained Marcus's future projections for expanding the program across multiple plantations. Sarah knew she needed to see those records, needed to understand the full scope of what had been done, but accessing Marcus's study was extraordinarily dangerous. The main house was off limits to field workers, and any enslaved person found there without legitimate reason would face severe punishment. Still, the knowledge that those records existed, that they documented everything Marcus had done, created an obsession in Sarah that matched Marcus's own obsession with breeding. She began planning how to access the study, and this PL Anning required resources and allies she'd been carefully cultivating. She needed someone to create a distraction that would draw household staff and overseers away from the main house. She needed someone who could pick the lock on Marcus's study door, a skill that existed among the enslaved population because people developed whatever abilities helped them survive. She needed people who would serve as lookouts, watching for anyone approaching while Sarah was inside the study. By mid-September, Sarah had assembled a team of 8 people willing to help. Isaac and 3 other field workers, Esther and 2 other household staff members, and an elderly man named Solomon, who'd once been a blacksmith and possessed skills with locks and metal work that made him valuable despite his age. They chose September 22nd for the attempt, a date when Marcus and Elizabeth Hargrove were scheduled to attend a gathering at a neighboring plantation, leaving the main house with reduced supervision. The plan was simple in concept, but terrifyingly risky in execution. Solomon would pick the lock on the study door. Sarah would enter and examine the records, copying or taking documents that seemed most important, while the others maintained watch and created minor disturbances elsewhere on the plantation that would keep overseers occupied. The day arrived with typical coastal weather, hot and humid with afternoon thunderstorms rolling in from the Atlantic. The weather actually helped. Rain and wind would keep people indoors or distracted by securing equipment and supplies. Marcus and Elizabeth departed for their social engagement in early afternoon, traveling by carriage with 2 household staff members as attendants. Sarah waited until evening when the main house stood mostly dark and quiet. She moved through the grounds with surprising stealth for someone her size, reaching the rear entrance, where Solomon waited with his lockpicks and nervous energy. Isaac and the others were positioned at strategic points, ready to create distractions if anyone approached. Solomon worked the lock for nearly 10 minutes, his hands shaking from age and nervousness before the mechanism clicked open. Sarah entered Marcus Hargrove's study, closing the door behind her and lighting a small candle that provided just enough illumination to see. The study was exactly as she'd glimpsed it once years earlier, dominated by a large desk covered with papers and ledgers, walls lined with bookshelves, and the portrait of Sarah hanging prominently where Marcus could see it from his desk. The sight of her own image reduced to decoration and proof of Marcus's theories sent fury through her that she had to consciously control. She found the ledgers in a locked desk drawer, but Solomon's lockpicks worked on this simpler mechanism. Inside were 3 leather-bound volumes, each filled with Marcus Hargrove's meticulous handwriting documenting decades of systematic human breeding. Sarah read by candlelight, her hands shaking as she absorbed information that exceeded her worst expectations. The first volume dated to her grandfather Alexander Hargrove's time. Documenting his initial experiments in the 1810s, Sarah learned about forced pairings, about children evaluated and found wanting, about people sold away when they didn't develop according to projections. She learned about pregnancies that ended in miscarriage or stillbirth because women were worked too hard during gestation. She learned about medical experiments Alexander had conducted, testing his theories about heredity by deliberately exposing pregnant women to different conditions and recording outcomes. The second volume covered Marcus Harrow's early years, managing the plantation from 1825 through 1835. Here, Sarah found references to her mother's previous pregnancies, 3 children before Sarah, all evaluated by Marcus and his father during Alexander's final years. The children had been sold to different plantations when they failed to show the desired physical characteristics. Families deliberately separated to make room for the next generation of experiments. Sarah found names. Her half-siblings, Thomas, sold to a tobacco plantation in Virginia in 1822. Rachel sold to a cotton operation in Alabama in 1823. Benjamin sold to a rice plantation in South Carolina in 1825. She had family she'd never known existed, scattered across hundreds of miles. Their locations documented in Marcus's careful records, alongside notations about why they'd been deemed unsuitable for the breeding program. The third volume was the most disturbing. It covered 1835 through the present and included detailed projections for the future. Marcus had documented Sarah's entire development, every measurement, every demonstration for visitors, every plan for her future use. But he'd also projected beyond Sarah, planning how her children would be incorporated back into the breeding program, creating an expanding network across multiple plantations in different states. Sarah discovered that Marcus had already negotiated with Charles Dry about purchasing back any children Sarah produced in Louisiana, bringing them to Georgia to continue the line. He'd made similar arrangements with two other plantation owners in South Carolina and Mississippi, creating a system where children from the breeding program would be distributed across multiple properties, then selectively brought together for future breeding as adults. The scope was breathtaking and horrifying. Marcus intended to create a network of plantations participating in coordinated breeding programs, sharing information and trading selected individuals to maximize desired traits. He envisioned this system expanding across the entire South, transforming slavery from merely an economic institution into a comprehensive program of human breeding that would span generations and geographic regions. Sarah found all of this documented in Marcus's precise handwriting, complete with financial projections about increased productivity and value. He'd calculated that enslaved people bred for specific traits could be sold for double or triple normal prices, creating massive profits that would incentivize other plantation owners to participate in the network. The rage that filled Sarah in that moment was clarifying. She'd known the breeding program was cruel, had lived with that cruelty every day of her life, but discovering the full scope, the casual destruction of families, the cold calculation behind every forced pregnancy, the vision of expanding this system across the entire South, transformed her understanding of what was at stake. She took specific pages from the ledgers, documents that detailed the breeding program's history and Marcus's future plans. She wanted evidence, wanted documentation that could prove what had been done even if she didn't survive. To tell the story herself, she carefully removed pages while trying to make the damage less obvious, then replaced the ledges in the drawer and prepared to leave. But as she extinguished her candle and prepared to exit the study, she heard voices outside. Marcus and Elizabeth returning earlier than expected from their social engagement. Sarah had seconds to make a decision, try to leave through the door and risk being seen, or hide inside the study and hope she wouldn't be discovered. She chose to hide, squeezing herself behind a tall bookshelf in the corner where shadows were deepest. She heard Marcus and Elizabeth enter the main house, heard their voices as they moved through rooms below, and she waited. In darkness, with her heart pounding so loud she feared it would give her away. Sarah remained hidden behind the bookshelf for nearly 3 hours, barely breathing, listening to sounds from elsewhere in the house. Marcus and Elizabeth had retired to their bedroom on the second floor, but household staff moved through the building, and Sarah could hear footsteps, voices, doors opening and closing. She couldn't leave without being discovered, and discovery would mean immediate punishment and likely torture to reveal if she'd taken anything or if others were involved. The documents she'd taken were folded inside her clothing, pressed against her body. If she was found and searched, those papers would be discovered, and everyone who'd helped her would face consequences. The risk multiplied with every passing minute, but Sarah had no safe way to leave until the household settled completely for the night. Finally, past midnight, the main house became truly quiet. Sarah waited another 30 minutes to be certain, then carefully emerged from behind the bookshelf. Her legs were cramped from hours of remaining motionless, and she moved slowly to restore circulation before approaching the study door. She opened it carefully, checking the hallway beyond. Empty, she moved through the main house like a ghost, using skills she'd developed during years of being observed. The other overseers present, 2 men armed with clubs, hesitated in shock, never having witnessed an enslaved person, particularly a woman, engage in direct, violent resistance. That hesitation cost them. Isaac and 2 others attacked while the overseers were distracted by Sarah, and within seconds all 3 plantation authority figures were on the ground, disarmed and injured. "Run!" Sarah shouted to her group toward the coast. "Stay together!" They ran through storm and darkness, leaving the plantation's main complex behind. Behind them, alarms were being raised, other overseers being alerted, but they had perhaps a 15-minute head start before organized pursuit could begin. Sarah's plan had been to reach the coastal islands, where the complex geography of maritime forests, tidal marshes, and numerous waterways would make tracking difficult. But reaching the coast required covering 6 miles of open country where they'd be visible once daylight came. They ran through fields and woods, stumbling in darkness, soaked by rain, driven by fear and hope and Sarah's unshakable will. Some struggled to keep pace, and Sarah would fall back to help them, using her strength to literally carry people when necessary, refusing to leave anyone behind. By dawn, they'd reach the coastal marshlands. They could see the islands in the distance, separated from the mainland by wide expanses of tidal creeks and mudflats. Crossing would require wading through water, navigating around deep channels, and timing their movement with tidal patterns. Behind them, they could hear sounds of pursuit, dogs barking, men shouting, the organized chaos of slave catchers beginning their hunt. Sarah understood that their brief window was closing, that within hours professional trackers would be following their trail with dogs and weapons. "Into the water," she commanded. "The creeks will hide our scent from the dogs. Stay close to me and watch for deep channels." They entered the marsh, cold water rising to their waists, mud sucking at their feet. The crossing took 3 hours, during which 2 people nearly drowned in deep channels and had to be rescued by Sarah, whose strength and height allowed her to maintain footing where others couldn't. They reached Sapelo Island exhausted, terrified, but alive. The island offered thick maritime forests that would provide cover, and Sarah led them deep into the interior before allowing anyone to rest. For the next 2 weeks, they survived through foraging, fishing, and constant vigilance. The slave catchers came to the island repeatedly, searching with dogs and systematic sweeps. But the dense vegetation and complex terrain allowed Sarah's group to evade capture through constant movement and careful hiding. But survival required more than evasion. They needed food. They needed information about safe routes north. And they needed resources they couldn't obtain while hiding on an isolated island. Sarah made the difficult decision that some people would have to return to the mainland to gather supplies. Knowing this would increase the risk of capture, Isaac volunteered for this mission along with 2 others. They left on October 30th and never returned. Sarah learned later that they'd been captured within hours of reaching the mainland, and the punishment administered was so severe that one didn't survive. The loss devastated the group. They'd known the risks intellectually, but experiencing the reality of friends captured and brutalized made the danger immediate and personal. Some wanted to surrender, believing that continued resistance would only lead to more deaths. Others were determined to keep fighting, arguing that surrender meant everything they'd sacrificed would be for nothing. Sarah let people make their own choices. One woman, pregnant and terrified for her unborn child, chose to return to the plantation voluntarily, hoping her condition would spare her the worst punishment. Sarah gave her what little food they had and watched her disappear into morning mist without judgment. By early November, 8 people remained with Sarah on Sapelo Island. They were hungry, exhausted, and increasingly desperate. The slave catchers had refined their search patterns, and it was becoming harder to avoid detection. Sarah understood they couldn't stay on the island indefinitely, but she also knew that leaving meant exposing themselves to capture on the mainland. On November 7th, the slave catchers found them. The confrontation happened in a maritime forest near a tidal creek where Sarah's group had taken shelter for the night. The slave catchers approached at dawn, moving quietly through fog that limited visibility. By the time Sarah's lookout noticed them, escape was impossible. They were surrounded. The lead slave catcher, a man named Robert Ellis, known for brutal efficiency, called out for surrender. He promised that compliance would result in lighter punishment, while resistance would be met with overwhelming force. His men were armed with rifles, clubs, and rope for binding captives. Sarah's response was to attack. She emerged from the trees and charged Ellis directly, moving with speed that shocked men who assumed her size would make her slow. She tackled him before he could raise his rifle, her momentum carrying both of them to the ground. Her strength was overwhelming. She pinned him easily, could have killed him with her bare hands, but she chose to disarm and restrain rather than murder. The other slave catchers responded by firing, and chaos erupted in the forest. Sarah's group scattered, some trying to flee deeper into the woods, others joining the Fig. Out of desperation or loyalty, Sarah continued battling Ellis and two other men simultaneously, throwing them aside with apparent ease. But bullets were flying and the slave catchers had numerical advantage. 3 members of Sarah's group fell to gunfire within the first minute. Others were clubbed down as they tried to run. Sarah herself was shot in the shoulder, a wound that would have incapacitated most people, but only seemed to enrage her further. She fought with the accumulated fury of 17 years of dehumanization, of being measured and evaluated, of being reduced to numbers in breeding journals, of knowing that Marcus Harrove had planned every aspect of her life, including her future children. She broke bones, inflicted injuries that would leave men hospitalized for weeks, and for several terrifying minutes, it seemed possible she might actually win through sheer physical dominance. But there were too many of them, and they had guns. Sarah was shot twice more, beaten with rifle butts, and eventually overwhelmed through the simple arithmetic of multiple men restraining her simultaneously. Even then, it took 7 men to hold her down, and they had to use chains meant for restraining livestock because rope wouldn't hold her. By the time Marcus Harrove arrived on Sapalo Island later that day, brought by urgent message about the capture, 8 people from Sarah's group were dead or dying. 3 had been captured alive but severely injured, and Sarah herself was chained to a tree, bleeding from 3 gunshot wounds and countless other injuries. Marcus surveyed the scene with an expression that combined fury, satisfaction, and calculating interest. He'd lost enslaved people he'd invested years in developing, had suffered financial losses from the sabotage and the disrupted sale to Louisiana, and had been humiliated by Sarah's resistance becoming known among other plantation owners. But he'd also proven that even the strongest enslaved person could be captured and controlled. He'd reasserted dominance through violence, and he was already planning how to use this situation to his advantage. How to reshape the narrative from embarrassing resistance into a demonstration of plantation management's effectiveness. The aftermath of the Sapelo Island confrontation created complications Marcus Harrove hadn't fully anticipated: the violence of the capture, the deaths of multiple enslaved people, and the extraordinary circumstances of a woman physically battling professional slave catchers drew attention from neighboring plantations and local authorities. Word spread through coastal Georgia about the incident, and reactions varied widely. Some plantation owners praised Marcus for his efficient response, seeing the capture as proof that even organized resistance could be suppressed. Others questioned what conditions on the Harrove plantation had sparked such desperate rebellion, wondering if Marcus's breeding program had created instability that threatened the broader social order. A few raised concerns about the financial losses involved between the dead and injured enslaved people, damaged equipment, and disrupted harvest. Marcus had suffered tens of thousands of dollars in damages. The sale to Charles Dree collapsed immediately. Dupree sent a brief letter terminating the agreement, citing Sarah's demonstrated violent tendencies and questioning whether she could ever be safely controlled. He withdrew his initial payment and severed all business relationships with Marcus, concerned that association with the incident would damage his own reputation among Louisiana plantation owners. Other potential buyers similarly withdrew interest. Sarah had become infamous rather than valuable, and the publicity around her resistance made her unsellable to none concerned about importing trouble onto their own plantations. Marcus faced a difficult decision: what to do with Sarah. He couldn't sell her, but keeping her was dangerous and expensive. She required constant surveillance, secure confinement, and medical treatment for her gunshot wounds that cost money he resented spending on someone who'd caused such enormous losses. He ultimately decided to keep Sarah as a kind of example, a demonstration that resistance would be punished absolutely. He had her wounds treated. Infection would have killed her otherwise. Then confined her to a structure he ordered built specifically for her. A cell-like building with heavy wooden walls, barred windows, and a door that locked from outside. She was kept in chains even inside the cell. Her movement restricted to prevent any possibility of escape or violence. Sarah's punishment extended beyond confinement. She was put to work at the hardest tasks on the plantation, always under guard, always chained, always isolated from other enslaved people to prevent her influence from spreading. Her food rations were reduced to minimal survival levels, eliminating the extra nutrition she'd received throughout her life. Marcus intended to break her completely, to transform her from symbol of resistance into warning about resistance's consequences. But Marcus made a critical miscalculation. He kept his journals. Despite everything that had happened, despite Sarah's theft of documents and the clear evidence that his records had been compromised, Marcus couldn't bring himself to destroy decades of careful documentation. He believed the journals were too valuable, representing his life's work in developing the breeding program. He had them bound in new covers, locked them in a reinforced safe in his rebuilt study, and convinced himself they were secure. The main house fire occurred on December 17th, 1843, approximately 6 weeks after Sarah's capture. It started in Marcus Harrow's study during the early morning hours around 3 a.m. when everyone in the house was sleeping. The fire spread with unusual speed, consuming the study completely and extending into adjoining rooms before household staff could respond effectively. Marcus, his wife Elizabeth, and their 2 children escaped through second-floor windows, suffering smoke inhalation and minor injuries, but surviving. 4 enslaved household staff members also escaped, though 2 were badly burned trying to fight the fire before it became clear the house couldn't be saved. The investigation into the fire's cause was inconclusive. The official determination was accidental, likely a lamp left burning that overturned, or a spark from the fireplace that caught on papers. But some observers noted suspicious aspects. The fire's unusual intensity, its apparent origin in multiple locations within the study, and the complete destruction of Marcus's office, while other parts of the house showed less damage. No evidence directly connected the fire to any person. Sarah was locked in her cell with guards watching constantly, making it impossible for her to have started it personally. Other enslaved people on the plantation had no obvious opportunity or means to access the main house at that hour. Yet rumors circulated through the quarters about divine justice, about the ancestors watching and taking action, about how fires sometimes start themselves when they're needed. People whispered about the documents Sarah had stolen during her escape attempt, wondering if others had taken similar actions that contributed to the fire's origin or spread. The journals documenting the breeding program burned completely. The safe Marcus had installed proved insufficient protection against a fire that Harton sustained when the ruins cooled, and for investigation, searchers found only ashes and twisted metal where Marcus's life work had been stored. The pages Sarah had stolen during her October 22nd infiltration survived because she'd given them to the pregnant woman who'd chosen to return voluntarily. That woman had buried them in a sealed oilskin pouch in the maritime forest of Sapalo Island, in a location she described to Sarah during their final conversation. Those pages remained hidden for decades, eventually discovered by a freed black man named Augustus Smalls in 1877, who was foraging for roots in the same forest where Sarah's group had hidden 34 years earlier. Augustus turned the documents over to a Presbyterian minister in Savannah who worked with freed people, and that minister recognized their historical significance. The pages eventually made their way into the archives of the Georgia Historical Society, where they remain. 18 pages of Marcus Harrow's handwriting documenting 3 generations of systematic human breeding, calculating financial returns from selling children, projecting future expansion of breeding programs across the South. Historians who've studied those pages describe them as among the most disturbing documents to survive from the antebellum period. Not because they describe unusual cruelty. Many plantation records document horrific acts, but because they demonstrate the systematic, calculated nature of treating human reproduction as agricultural science. The pages reveal how slavery wasn't merely economic exploitation, but an attempt to control human biology itself to shape future generations according to profit calculations and theories about heredity. Sarah remained enslaved on the Harrow plantation until 1851. The years following her capture and the fire were characterized by brutal routine. She worked under constant guard at the hardest tasks, lived in isolation from the community that had supported her, and endured conditions designed to break her will without killing her outright. Marcus never rebuilt the main house to its former grandeur. The fire had cost him enormous sums, coming on top of losses from the sabotage and disrupted harvest. He constructed a smaller, more modest residence and operated the plantation with reduced staff and resources. His breeding program effectively ended with the fire that destroyed his documentation. Without those records, he couldn't track lineages or make informed decisions about future pairings. In 1851, facing continuing financial difficulties, Marcus sold several enslaved people to settle debts. Sarah was among them, purchased by a cotton merchant from Alabama named James Whitfield for $800, far less than the $5,000 Charles Dupree had once offered, reflecting both Sarah's age and her reputation for resistance. Sarah was transported to Alabama and put to work in cotton processing, heavy labor that utilized her strength while keeping her under constant supervision. Records show she worked at Whitfield's operation until at least 1860, appearing in that year's census records as property valued at $700. After 1860, documentation ends. Whether Sarah lived to see emancipation in 1865, whether she survived the Civil War years when Alabama became a battleground, whether she ever found the siblings Marcus's records had revealed existed scattered across Virginia, Alabama, and South Carolina. None of these questions can be definitively answered. The Harrow Plantation continued operating until Sherman's March to the Sea in 1864, when Union forces swept through Georgia, liberating enslaved people and destroying infrastructure supporting the Confederacy. Marcus Hargrove died in 1859, and the plantation passed to distant relatives who sold it after the war. The property changed hands multiple times over following decades, and by the early 20th century, the original plantation buildings had largely decayed or been demolished. What remains are fragments. The 18 pages in the Georgia Historical Society archives, brief mentions and letters between plantation owners discussing Marcus' breeding program, census records listing Sarah's existence as property, and court documents from the 1843 incident on Sapilo Island describing her capture and the deaths of 8 people. Local historians in McIntosh County maintain that the maritime forest on Sapilo Island, where the final confrontation occurred, remains haunted by those who died there, though such claims say more about how communities remember trauma than about supernatural realities. The forest itself is unchanged. Live oaks draped with Spanish moss, palmettos rustling in coastal wind, tidal creeks flowing according to moon phases, unchanged since 1843. Sarah's story forces us to confront unsettling truths about what human beings are capable of when one group claims absolute power over another. The breeding program Marcus Harrow and his father engineered wasn't unique in its cruelty. Similar operations existed across the South, but its surviving documentation offers an unusually stark portrait of systematic dehumanization. Enslaved people were reduced to breeding stock, their families torn apart, their bodies manipulated according to profit charts and generational projections. Yet the story also reveals the complicated nature of resistance. Sarah's rebellion did not grant her freedom, but it achieved something profound. It disrupted Marcus Harrow's plans, destroyed the records that would have allowed the program to expand, and left behind a living trace of defiance that endured long after the people involved were gone. Her physical strength, intended to be a tool of exploitation, became the very weapon she used to strike back the trade. DY isn't limited to what was inflicted on Sarah alone. It extends to the countless others whose lives were shaped by similar programs across the South. People whose stories were never written down. People whose resistance was never recorded. Names that appear only as numbers in ledgers where human lives were assigned monetary value. The 18 surviving pages in the archives tell only a fragment of the truth. They stand in place of thousands of untold histories. Families dismantled, children sold away, reproductive futures controlled by men who viewed human beings as projects to refine. This mystery reminds us that the most horrifying stories are rarely supernatural. They are human inventions born from systems designed to maximize profit by stripping individuals of their humanity. The breeding programs didn't fail because the enslaved were compliant. They failed because resistance, even without achieving freedom, created enough disruption to keep the system from fulfilling its ambitions. Over time, Sarah's strength became legendary along the Georgia coast. The stories twisted and grew, adopting supernatural elements that blurred the historical truth. But at the center remains a powerful reality. A woman engineered for strength used that very strength as an act of rebellion. She didn't win freedom, but she won something else: the destruction of the system intended to reproduce itself through her children and grandchildren. What do you think this story reveals? Do you believe the surviving records tell the whole truth, or are there darker histories still hidden in archives, attics, and family papers across the South? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more stories that blend history with horror, stories that force us to confront uncomfortable truths, be sure to subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share this video with someone who loves a mystery row. Oded in reality. See you in the next one.